sex and intimacy are really strangely taboo topics in Christianity. And if you've been in the church for any length of time, you know that chances are most people are not willing to talk about their sexual past, their sexual present. Most couples are a little hesitant to interact with people when maybe if they're married, they're having sexual troubles, or if things are going exceptionally well, no one really seems to want to talk about that. Or some churches even, and some Christian kind of like groups will actually kind of make sex like this flamboyant, goofy thing that we should like always talk about, and it should be something that's such a casual conversation. And so you get this like weird idea of how sex is really integrated into the Christian faith at all. And in addition to that, in the evangelical world, which is a world that has unfortunately put a real bad marking on what sexual intimacy can look like, it has unfortunately caused this idea of intimacy to fall short of what it's actually meant to be for a Christian. You have individuals, Christians who have been Christians for a long time and very little amount of time, that are not married, or they are married, or they have very good friends or whatnot. But what they kind of struggle to see in their Christian faith is the importance of intimacy, this importance of nearness and being with people that know not just your physical desires, which is what I think our culture calls intimacy. Someone who understands your physical desires and helps you satisfy them. That is not what intimacy is. That is not what intimacy from a psychological perspective is, biological perspective, biblical perspective, Judeo-Christian worldview perspective. It's not biological engagement. Intimacy has biology as a component of it, but intimacy is a deep knowledge and abiding joy with the presence of someone else. And what has unfortunately happened in our churches and in our Christian world today, which is why it's one of the most looked up topics online, on YouTube and on Google and on any of these platforms, is that Christians want to know what does God think about sex? What does God think about intimacy? What is Jesus like? Why was Jesus single? But yet it looks like the apostles may have had spouses and may have had children, and like, what are we supposed to do with all of that? One of the foundational truths that I've found to be so compelling to me about the Christian faith when it comes to intimacy and sex, and the importance of both, but also the importance of both of them being understood in their own right world and the right context, because you can have intimacy without sex and you can have sex without intimacy. And we know that to be true. What I have just found to be so deeply compelling for my soul is in the 400s, 400 AD, there was a group of Christians who were writing a theological creedal statement on the Trinity. And they were talking about God the Son, God the Father, and God the Spirit. And they were talking about the divineness of both, or all three of them, as three persons of the Trinity, three distinct persons. And one of the ways that they described their inner working as a Trinity was that each person of the Trinity, the Son, the Father, and the Spirit, have an insatiable desire, a perfect insatiable desire to relinquish all of their love on the other. So Jesus is for all eternity relinquishing and giving up his love to the Spirit, and the Spirit to the Father, and the Father to the Son. And the early church fathers actually said that this view of the Trinity, which is not really a distinct view of the Trinity, it's just a more comprehensive view of how God interacts with himself. They said that this view is called the divine dance of God. That God is divinely dancing with himself in perfection, and there is perfect love, perfect grace, perfect care, perfect just a saturation, if you will, of relationship. And they say that this divine dance is exactly what intimacy is supposed to look like. I don't think it is coincidental that this is how God works. This is how the Trinity works. I don't think it's coincidental that this is actually how Paul describes what marriage is supposed to look like between a husband and a wife and God. That there is supposed to be a complete relinquishing of love to one another, and not be and there's a terrifying component to that, right? Like if you're sitting there watching this episode and you're going like, oh my gosh, like if God's desire for me is intimacy, and the definition of intimacy is what God does with himself, then that means that I'm going to have to relinquish all of who I am to somebody or to a group of people. I'm going to be opening myself up in such a way that I could seriously get hurt. I could get offended. I could lose someone I care about deeply. I mean, there's so much vulnerability, and yet without vulnerability, there's no such thing as intimacy. It's completely impossible. And so you have Paul in the book of Ephesians actually describing how the husband and wife are supposed to sacrificially love one another, just as Jesus Christ sacrificially loved the church. And if Jesus sacrificially loved the church in the way that Jesus also sacrificially loves the Spirit and the Father, you actually have this divine dance that should be called intimacy. This is the biblical view of what Christian life should look like for you and for me, which means, friend, that if you're single, you can experience the intimacy that God has for you if you place yourself in a scenario with where you can actually relinquish your love and give it to someone else, give it to God. You can actually have the intimacy that you so crave with Jesus, not from a biological standpoint, but from a spiritual and metaphysical standpoint. If you're married, you can have this divine sort of dance with your spouse. Like this is actually just a beautiful way to understand your own marriage, that as a husband or as a wife, your responsibility is to divinely dance with your spouse and with Jesus Christ as the head of your marriage, so that way that there is a relinquishing of love that's satisfied by the sheer fact that Jesus has already died on the cross for you, that he has given you a Spirit, that he loves you. And that is the foundational drive to which then you can experience love with your spouse. And so it's kind of a two-part conversation, really. Is intimacy important to Christianity? Absolutely. Because you can't have friendships and the church and community without intimacy. And yet also, can you have true sex without intimacy? And the answer to that biblically is no. I have two books that I think that are just really encouraging to my soul and encouraging to our church, and I would really hope that they'd be encouraging to you as well. C.S. Lewis, an old philosopher, Christian, used to be an atheist, converted to Christianity, wrote a lot of books. Chronicles of Narnia is actually the one he's most famous for, but he wrote this book called The Four Loves. And in this book, he talks about the four different types of love that we were meant to relinquish to others. You have this friendship love, you have a charity type of love, you have this eros love, which is divinely orchestrated, you have this affectionate love towards people, and he literally says we were made for intimacy, for these types of loves, so that we could be the fullest human that we could be. And one of the things that I found so profound in the friendship section, because I know a lot of you that are watching this class are actually single, is that he actually talks about how friendship in this book is one of the scariest ways to love somebody, because a friend can leave. And he said, but you will never actually see someone unlock the depths of your heart unless you allow them into your heart as a friend, because there's actually not a covenant binding you anymore, but it's simply trust and friendship. And he says that if you don't open your heart up to have that genuine friendship where someone can unlock you and to be the person you were made to be, then you'll actually never experience true friendship, which then therefore means that you'll never experience true intimacy, and which is maybe a reason why your relationship with Jesus is struggling, or you don't have much intimacy with him, is because you haven't let him unlock your heart in the way that he also made friends to be able to unlock your heart. There's another book I love called Sacred Sex. And this is a wonderful book that talks about the importance of the sacredness of sexual intimacy with a couple. And if you're ever asking the question, like, Why is sex so important to God? You have to go back to the question of intimacy again. Sex is important to God, and God has regulations on sex that it should be between a man and a woman in the context of a covenanted community, which would be called marriage biblically. The reason why those regulations are there is because when you have a covenanted couple paired with one another and with God, where there is safety and security, and there is foundational elements of what of that looks like the Trinity, what you then can have is sacred sex. You can have holy, intimate, beautiful sex with your loved one, with your husband or with your wife. And the reason why it is so beautiful is because it looks like the divine dance with God. God isn't having intercourse with himself. There's no biological need of God, but there's an intimacy desire of him. And the greatest way that we have as people to know the depth of love that he has for us is when you are utterly vulnerable and you experience sacred sex or sacred intimacy. I think that people who have been single for a long time or chosen to be single or have the gift of singleness by God, they can experience that intimacy with God and friends, and they can find that fulfillment. And those who are married, they can find that fulfillment as well. But as Christians, we have been made for intimacy. We have been made for this divine dance that God is already participating in, and we're just invited into that. And so the challenge that I have for you as you're looking through this class and you're working through the workbook and you're going through all of the studies on this is to begin to ask yourself the question, am I creating opportunities for myself to be intimate with others in a very pure way and then also a very, very profound way? Am I surrounded by people in my church? Do I go to a church where intimacy is available, where I can worship Jesus in an intimate manner? Do I have people that I would call family, brothers and sisters in Christ that are just like, that are so near to me that I would die for them, as Jesus says that that's what ultimate love truly is. And those of you who are in marriage and have a spouse, begin to ask yourself the question, am I seeing my relationship with my spouse in the same way that God works in the Trinity? Am I giving up all of who I am, knowing that I could lose everything, but knowing that there is a distinct possibility that my giving up will then be her giving up or him giving up to Christ, and then Christ giving up back for me? And can that divine dance happen in my marriage? It's a great way for you to ask those questions, dive into those things, pursue a biblical theology of sex throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. In the workbook, we'll actually dive into just kind of the radicalness of sex that's in the Song of Psalms and a couple other sections in the Old Testament. But we'll also talk about the intimacy purposes of the church in the workbook as well. And so consider the possibility that Christ made you for intimacy, that the Trinity looks like intimacy, and that's being freely offered to you as someone who's growing in your faith in Jesus Christ. And so pursue that, consider that, and work through the workbook to help you grow in that as well.